To invite Professor Matthew Farber, who's come all the way from the University of Colorado to speak to you. Matthew, please.
Thank you. Oh. Hi. Is this working? Everybody can hear me? Is this better? Oh, okay. Do they know that? This isn't working very well. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for joining me this morning. I know there's always a little bit of technical things. So, um, in my experience, I'm an associate professor, and in my experience, the technical things always work when nobody's in the room. I have that same experience. So good morning. I have some notes here, so just keep me on track. But good morning. I'm here today to talk about reading games well, how players evoke personal and subjective meanings. This talk is going to introduce ideas from a book that I wrote with Tracy Fullerton called The Well-Read Game on Playing Thoughtfully, which is coming out March 25th of 2025 from MIT Press in their Playful Thinking series. All right, so let's start by going back to the future. This is a really embarrassing photo of me as a child back in the 1980s, and we'll start with that. In case anybody is curious how old I am, I won't say, but I can hint that I am this year's old. This is my first video game console. Back then, the Atari 2600. Maybe you remember the wonderful wood grain cabinetry there. This is one of my favorite games as a child growing up, the game Adventure, which was not quite a role-playing game yet, but it was a fun game for me because it was the first game that had an actual Easter egg in the game. The designer, Warren Robinette, signed the game secretly, and for all of us kids in the U.S. suburbs, it was super fun, passing along like, hey, there's this thing here. If you move the gate here, you'll find the name. So back then in 1982, the Commodore 64 was released. This is where I first learned and struggled to program. And the Commodore 64 programming was a little frustrating, but there's a new book coming out by Jesper Juhl, who's a game studies scholar. And his book is going to be called Too Much Fun. And in the book, he observed that the C64 was by far the best-selling home computer of the time. Not the Apple II or the early Mac, but it was this. It was affordable, and it was also the platform with the most known video games. From 1985 to 1993, there are 5,500 games that were created, not including ones I made myself in my room, but 5,500 games were made on the Commodore 64. So let's fast forward 30 years to 2013. And at that time, I was a social studies teacher. These are my students right here. And my classes in this photo, they were beta testing SimCity EDU, which was an educational version, an official educational version, official from EA, Electronic Arts, of SimCity that was created to measure systems thinking skills in children. And I mean, the 13-year-old version of myself back in the Back to the Future slide would be super impressed with me using a AAA game in a classroom. And, it seemed pretty amazing at first, right? And it is obviously much more engaging than a textbook, as you can see by my former student there's enthusiasm. But, in the end, it was basically a textbook. It took all the sandbox elements out, and it became more of an assessment tool, this idea of game-based assessment, which I wasn't too comfortable with. So a couple years later, I started using this other game in my social studies class called The Migrant Trail, which is a spin on the Oregon Trail, which is a classic educational history game. Except in this version, I found it more meaningful because it evoked these personal responses and connections from many of my students. The Migrant Trail is a game that's based on a documentary film called The Undocumented from the early 2010s. And it is about players playing on two roles. First is Border Patrol, and then the second as migrants who cross the Sonoran Desert from Mexico into the United States by help of a coyote, which is a way somebody that gets paid too much to do this dangerous journey. National Public Radio at the time thought it was so interesting that I was using a game and not a textbook for such a current issue, which is still a current issue, that they did a segment on it. And the reporter remarked that I was taking my students on what would otherwise be known as an impossible field trip. I mean, obviously, I couldn't fly students to the Sonoran Desert. But more than that was going on. Kids were connecting to the game. One student had a personal response. She was the child of immigrants, and she tearfully thanked me after class for using this game in the classroom. So this is a lot different of an experience than a systems thinking game that I was using, SimCity EDU. My name is Matthew Farber, and these days I'm an associate professor of educational technology at the University of Northern Colorado. I'm also the co-director of the Gaming SEL Lab and author of several books and studies on games and learning, a few I'll share today. My research focuses on how some games cultivate social and emotional learning skills such as empathy, perspective taking, and compassion. My work over the years includes several collaborations with UNESCO MGIEP, which is the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, which brought me to India 3 other times. I co-wrote a paper for MGIEP with Dr. Karen Schreier on the limits and strengths of using games as so-called empathy machines. I was also part of MGIEP's curriculum writing and research into Bury Me My Love, which is a game-based study that we conducted in New Delhi and in Dubai, and I believe it was shared last year here at the conference. Recently, I published a paper on pairing books and games together with literacy professor at my university, and just last week, like November 7th, on my birthday, we had a article published right there from my lab on cultivating esports personship, which is a term that we coined, on how scholastic esports coaches perceive facilitating positive youth development. And I've worked on several lessons around narrative games, using the game itself as if it were a textbook or more so as a novel, I would say, more than a textbook. For instance, Museum of Me is a free set of lessons for 5 games around the video game What Remains of Edith Finch, which I created with Paul DeMarcy he's in Canada. And it culminates with students curating objects like museum displays representing who they are. This past year, I worked with Array Films in Hollywood to develop a learning companion for Academy Award nominee Ava DuVernay's Origin, which chronicles the book Cast on the origins of our discontents, which is free. It's on origin101.org. And I was also a curriculum advisor to Slam Out Loud, which is a New Delhi-based art education nonprofit. I'm a play theorist, so let's quickly review some play theories and what their thoughts are, because after all, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Play theorists have long argued about how and why we play, as well as how to define play. First, let's start with the early play theorists and philosophers of the 20th century. Roger Colloy, his influential essay published in English as Man Playing Games, presents one of the earliest unified theories of play. In it, he categorized play into 4 main types. I don't want to get in the weeds, but just as a quick, just an overview here. But he contrasted ludus, which is rule-based play, with paideia, which is play that is imaginative and unstructured. One of the other powerful concepts is the magic circle from Johann Hunziker, and as game designers, you likely know the notion of the magic circle as it offers permission to act accordingly to the rules of play rather than the rules of life. Within the magic circle, we perform what actions we might otherwise consider not possible in the real world. So when we think about that, what parts of the human experience are we not yet exploring with games in the magic circle? Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky studied play to understand children's cognitive development. Piaget proposed that children intellectually develop by play, first through games of make-believe, and then in more structured games with rules. Vygotsky wrote about socio-dramatic play, which describes how children create and act out imaginary roles and scenarios. Our ability to take on make-believe roles and play as characters we control in games is an important aspect of our subjective interpretation of experiences in play. To Brian Sutton Smith, as well as to many modern play theorists like me, play has its roots in our evolutionary adaptations. Hide and seek, tag, tossing a ball are more than playing games. These activities reflect how humans hunted and evaded predators. In other words, as scholar Peter Gray writes, we are hardwired for play patterns that prepare us for challenges that humans previously faced in our collective hunter-gatherer past. Brian Sutton Smith challenged rigid demarcations around definitions of play. Importantly, he wrote that outside spectators cannot determine whether an activity is play, as it is subjective, and can best be determined only by the players. So we can play imaginatively at any time and in any place, and only we as individuals may know or understand that we are playing. As an example of play theory in action, in our book, we look at Stray from Blue 12 Studio. It's a video game where players take on the role of a stray cat. Set in a cyberpunk-inspired universe, humans seem to have disappeared, leaving behind plants, robots, and zerks, which are these mutated bug-like enemies that swarm players. And of course, a stray cat. The narrative is revealed through memories that are remembered in the game's language, right? Memories that are remembered by B12, which is the cat's companion robot drone. The memories are then put together by the player in the player's mind as part of a layering of a narrative and experience that provokes wondering about the past, what happened in this world, and anticipation of what might happen. When I played, I journaled my experience and subjective play. I wander through Dead City, encountering robots, some of whom water plants, play guitar, and weave blankets. These are the slower parts of the game, which I prefer. I take my time, performing and leaping around as a cat would. I've never owned a cat, just dogs. I'm a dog person. I sometimes feel prompted, though, to curl up on the rug or scratch at a wall. Playing as a cat is oddly satisfying. This is from Instagram, coincidentally. Loveland Public Library is one town over from where I live in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I found this on their Instagram. There's a child here. This boy's experience, who's much younger than me, was way different than mine. In the exact same game, with the same controls, the same UI, the same missions, the same levels, this child would have had a different reading than mine. This child felt what we call in psychology and game studies virtual empathy with B12, the seemingly sentient in-game companion. So much so that at the library, he 3D printed a toy version of B12. That's how meaningful the AI system was with the boy. I had a different feeling because I already understand how the hero's journey works in games and sacrifice and the story. So for me, I anticipated it differently, and what parts of the game, for me, resonated differently than this child in the exact same game. So how many of you know Tracy Fullerton or her book, which is one of the best-selling books in game design? Tracy Fullerton is an experimental game designer, professor, and director of the Game Innovation Lab at the University of Southern California in that games program. And many of you have likely learned game design with her book, which is now in the 5th edition. Her students have gone on to create some award-winning games like Journey, Sky, Children of the Light, Outer Wilds, What Remains of Edith Finch. Tracy and I have collaborated on the curriculum for Walden a Game EDU, the educational version of her award-winning Walden a Game, which is free for educators. We're still awaiting the cover. It's coming any second. So Tracy and I wrote a book for MIT Press, which comes out this March. And it's a culmination of our shared ideas and work around play, learning, and literacy that we have been addressing separately and together for many, many years. Early in the book, we include this quote from a 15-year-old young girl who played Journey, and this quote is from 2016. The young player, Sophia, said, "We had this experience where we would play with people not knowing who they were and still have a profound connection with them. Toward the end of the game, it suddenly gets really cold and icy, and it becomes really difficult to progress. Eventually, your character sort of gives up. You can't go on any longer, and at that point, my dad and I thought it might have been the end of the game. It was sort of a sad ending until minutes later, the game comes back, and you're at your goal. You're at this beautiful mountaintop filled with all the creatures you've seen in the world below. And it's this beautiful example of the end, and that it doesn't have to be a bad thing. I think this gave my dad some kind of peace, because near the end of his life, he was playing a game that told him that in the end, it will be all right. It was a few weeks later, after he passed, that I realized this journey within the game, it reflected the journey I was going on with my dad. Our book, The Well-Read Game, is about the experiences we have when we play, not the outcomes of play, or the aesthetics of formal game structures, but the ephemeral and emotional experiences of being in play that all players have, though rarely discuss. We call these experiences readings because they involve so many of the same inherent aspects of engaging with literary, cinematic, and other expressive texts. We mean to shine a light on the beauty and importance of player-evoked experiences of being in play. What does it mean to read a game well? Reading games closely and deeply, performing our parts with active emotions, and reflecting on our play are all a part of the process of becoming a well-read player. The idea of the well-read game brings together a convergence of literary, media, and play theories. We based our ideas of a well-read game on the works of Brian Upton's situational game theory, Tracy Fullerton's play-centric design theory, Bernie DeKoven's well-played game philosophy, which influenced the title of our book, The Well-Read Game, The Well-Played Game, and Louise Rosenblatt's reader response theory. In their separate writings, Upton and Fullerton both shift the focus of game analysis from the game as a system, separate from the player, to the integrated experience of the player and the game. Or as Upton writes, quote, "In situational design, the nexus of play lies not in the interface between the player and the game, but inside the player's mind." Upton writes about anticipatory and interpretive play, a type of gameplay when we are not focused on immediate play, but rather on absorbing what has happened, what could happen, and what we'd like to happen. Bernie DeKoven describes in The Well-Played Game, A Player's Philosophy, that games are experiences created by players and for players. His statement that, quote, "winning does not have to become the goal," informs our sense that there is more to playing than winning or losing. Similar to these ideas of playing games, Louise Rosenblatt in the early and mid and late 20th century and others have characterized the act of reading poems and books as a, quote, relationship-building activity between the author and reader, a conversation between the written text and our interpretation and responses to it. Together, these theories point to a richer understanding of what a game is when evoked by the experience of a player, and how we might begin to better value these experiences to become more thoughtful readers of games. In our book, we demonstrate the potential of a game to be well read by looking at a game like Unpacking. Has anybody here played Unpacking? Okay. So Unpacking is a narrative game, actually. It can be a very, very simple game by extreme if you look at it from a systemic point of view. If we allow ourselves to play it without much aesthetic interpretation, it's really barely an experience at all. At the start of each level, we are presented with a room or set of rooms and a set of boxes. We click on boxes to reveal items that are stored within them. Then we click to place the items in the rooms. We do this over and over again until we have placed all of the items. Then the game is over. It's hardly worth discussing that level of engagement. If we take our reading one step further to participate in the metaphor of the game, we understand that clicking and placing is, as the title suggests, a representation of unpacking, and the rooms and houses represent the stages of a character's life, from their very first room alone in college to living with roommates, lovers, and finally building a permanent home for their family. Still, is this much to speak about? Can we read this game with an aesthetic stance? So when Tracy played the game, she journaled the following, which I will share with her permission, since she's literally not here. Also, fun fact, I'm not Tracy. So I'm going to give a little bit of a third-person view of her interpretation from our book. So she finds it immediately nostalgic. The first level is set in 1997, where she immediately recognizes some iconic toys in the character's room. The character, by the way, we never see. The Tamagotchi and a Game Boy. Tracy was not certain about the character's gender, but guesses maybe that the character is a girl. The unseen character in the game seems to like art and has a lot of art supplies, and she likes gaming, both physical and digital. She has board games and a soccer ball with her Game Boy. Everything in her room is colorful and upbeat. She seems to be a happy kid. She likes to journal, so she may be a bit introspective too. All of this is based on inferences, by the way. Tracy then tried making her room messy, putting all of her toys on the floor. But the game highlights them in red when you do that. She then realized that there was a bit of a constraint here. Though she can place the toys in creative ways around the room, she can't just toss them on the floor like a child might. Tracy observed that this is an interesting choice by the designers, almost like the game is enforcing the parents' rules about keeping your room clean. I wish I could do this for my son's room. So unpacking continued here. Whoops, sorry. We're going backwards this time. Here we go. So as she was unpacking everything in the first level and puts the toys away, she sees a picture right here. Here's a screenshot that says, "Finally, my own room." It is the tiniest bit of narrative. Tracy journaled that felt like she helped this young person establish themselves and their identity in their first private space. The game goes on to later levels, and unpacking continues. At the start of every level, we are faced with a mountain of boxes and empty space to fill with her stuff. We start to see the stuff over and over. It almost feels like our own stuff in a way after a while, because it becomes very recognizable. The character is obviously one who likes to hang on to childhood things, so we keep unpacking the same stuffed animals, including a dearly loved stuffed piggy, well into adulthood. The stuffed piggy and the rest of the brightly colored items becomes her trademark in the spaces that she shares. First with roommates, and then with a boyfriend, who apparently wears and likes only black and gray. The boyfriend level is a challenge from the start. As Tracy journaled, the unseen character in the game has boxes filled with games, and those go well with his games. But she also has a bunch of brightly colored clothes, underwear, shoes, and so on that won't fit in his closet or drawers. He hasn't even moved any of his stuff to make room for hers. His apartment is filled with his own stuff, and just trying to make some kind of niche to place her colorful, joyful items is a real challenge. Tracy senses a disaster in this relationship from the outset. What made her think she could move in with him? This level is so hard because the player can tidy up his closet and make room for her clothes, but you can't move his wall hangings. It seems like he is pretty particular about his art and so on, so no matter how hard Tracy tries, there is no place to hang up the character's diploma. In the end, she found that she had to shove it under the bed while unpacking in this level. This is one of the most traumatic and unfortunate moments in this character's life. When she puts that diploma under the bed, Tracy felt so bad for her. She knew the protagonist did not belong here in this space. From this reading of the first few levels of Unpacking, we can see a character developing and changing, facing the small but poignant challenges of a life. The system of the game is extremely simple. As mentioned, you point and click. But as a multimodal text, without any language, basically, images, sounds, and so forth, actions, it evokes a deep feeling in the player. A connection builds between our character and ourselves as we unpack their lives over and over, trying to help them fit in and finally belong somewhere. Our initial nostalgia for their recognizable items becomes care and concern for the specific items they carry with them in their lives. We can think about the items in our own lives that we cherish and why. What items will we always carry with us? What do they say about us? What special items will we pass to our children? What stories will we tell them about these special things? Unpacking is telling the story because we are noticing the story, interpreting it, and bringing our own experiences to it. If we don't notice, if we don't interpret, then there is no story. There is only unpacking item after item, like in a speed run. In this way, as already noted, it is a game that invites an aesthetic reading over a purely efferent one. When I played the game with my son, who incidentally last week asked me if they're going to make a second one of these, that's how long he remembers playing it, we were able to discuss some of the objects that he, 11-year-old at the time, now he's 14, he still remembers the game 3 years later, so that should say something, right? When he was 11, when we played, he would ask questions about some of the objects. It became a lovely intergenerational opportunity to talk about the character that was emerging, where they lived, and why they might have different objects in their home. I journaled our experience, so this is what I wrote. The bedroom looks a little bit like yours, I comment to my son, who is actually the one playing the game. I am sitting next to him on the couch, making suggestions as he plays. We recently moved multiple times when I took a professorship opportunity across the country from New Jersey to Colorado. And we first moved to an apartment, and then to a house, and now to another house, our permanent house. I watch as he methodically clicks the boxes and puts items in drawers, shelves, and closets, as he did in his own bedroom. He remarks to me that each room seems to have one item that does not belong, like a computer keyboard mixed in with the kitchen spices. That didn't happen when we moved, he says to me. Mom labeled all of the boxes by room. As he continues to unbox and unpack, my mind wanders. I think about the unwitting trauma that my career opportunity may have inflicted on my family, who had to pack and move several times. In my childhood, we never moved. I always went to the same school and woke up in the same bedroom. My son has moved twice, each time to a new bedroom, a different neighborhood, another school. As he unpacks, I hope that he too unpacks a better life. In 1990, Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop proposed a metaphor for the liminal boundaries of reading books. Her influential essay Mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors describes the way in which we, when we read, see ourselves reflected in the characters and worlds of books and are immersed in their narratives. Bishop wrote, books are sometimes windows offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. These windows are also sliding glass doors, and readers only have to walk through in imagination to become part of whatever world has been created or recreated by the author. When lighting conditions are just right, however, a window can also be a mirror. So Tracy, me, my son, we saw ourselves like a mirror being reflected back and unpacking, but differently, like different types of mirrors. We were also looking through a window and sliding glass door, though, at another person's life. So this is Venba. Hopefully you're familiar with Venba. I think the speaker is at the conference, one of the designers. Venba is from the game's website, a narrative cooking adventure where you play as an Indian mom who immigrated to Canada with her family in the 1980s. Players cook various dishes and restore lost recipes. Venba is very much a mirror reflecting one or more aspects of a player's identity or experience if you have a similar background to the family in this game. I do not. So for me, Venba is very much more of a window and sliding glass door in parts. Some parts aren't. I remember my grandmother cooking, and I have her little box of her recipes, right? So some of it to me is a mirror, right? So it's not like this, like one or the other, right? Finally, let's talk about Lost Words Beyond the Page. Lost Words Beyond the Page from Sketchbook Games is an award-winning narrative platformer about a young girl named Izzy who aspires to be a writer. This game became a mirror for me as I played during a difficult time in my life. Has anybody played this game before? Lost Words? It's a terrific narrative game. It won Games for Change Award, as did Venba, and it's on mobile. So in the game Lost Words, it's a similar platforming verbs you might see in like Super Mario Brothers, like running and jumping over obstacles, right? You know, it's a platformer. And it's in Astoria, which is Izzy's Storyland. And the scenes are visualized in this beautifully painted 2D world with traditional platforming elements. But at the first level, the quirk of the game is revealed. We are running and jumping over words of a young girl's journal. Izzy's grandmother knows that she dreams of becoming a writer. She tells Izzy when she gives her a journal for her birthday, a writer writes. As Izzy writes, we play as a tiny version of her, navigating over the words there, jumping from page to page until there's a little box that opens and then you move on. At the time I was playing, though, this scene opens up here. So we return to her journal. It goes from Astoria to the journal. So there's two things happening at once. So at one point, we return to the journal for some bad news. Izzy's grandmother has had a stroke and is in the hospital. Izzy is shocked and upset, and this shock of the experience is reflected by the sudden tragedy in her imagined story in Astoria. At the time when I was playing in the spring of 2022, my own mother was in the hospital and then in hospice, ill with a disease that was kept secret from me, from my whole family, from me, my wife, and my teenage son. She was the one who brought me the Atari 2600 and Commodore 64 computer I shared early in my talk. She was the one who filled my teenage library with monsters manuals and Dungeons and Dragons books and choose your own adventure stories. And I felt personally I responded and resonated with Izzy's rage, grief, and sadness because Izzy's loss was my loss. And that's her rage in her journal. This has only been a tease of what it means to read a game well. In our book, we dive deeply into aesthetic readings of games for players to experience what Louise Rosenblatt calls a, quote, shimmering interplay of meanings, associations, feeling tones, in a mutually defined relationship found in the interaction between a player and a game. just as we might find between the reader and a literary text. As game designers, you wield an extraordinary kind of power, the power to shape worlds, inspire journeys, and help people connect to their own humanity. As the superhero Spider-Man learned in his conference talk right here, with great power comes great responsibility. The responsibility extends to the moments you create, the stories you tell, the communities we all foster. You have the chance to remind others what it means to feel alive, to be vulnerable, to dream, to connect. Let's use this power to make games that bring out the best in all of us and keep us beautifully, wonderfully human. Tracy Fullerton and I look forward to being able to share these ideas with you further when the book comes out, which I checked is on pre-order on Amazon India. Pre-order, please. From MIT Press and also Penguin Random House. And with that, it says here we have 4 minutes and 23 seconds, no pressure. So are there any questions? Q&A time. No, thank you, thank you. Yes. Right.
Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Super inspiring. I'm Rob Tiebe, game from the Netherlands. I was especially intrigued by a lot of your stories and games talk about empathy, and they let players understand this character and the worries and motivations. We do a lot the same between doctors and patients because they have this empathy problem as well. Doctors see.
We were just talking about that actually.
Yeah.
Nursing empathy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Doctors see patients as a body, and
right.
people are people. But the challenge is always how do you get, for example, those doctors and patients to play the game? Because for most people it's still, it's a game. They're occupied with their disease, Netflix, Candy Crush, the normal things. And I think you might have solutions for that because you have a lot of games. If people would only play it, it would make the world so much better.
Yeah, I know that's always a consistent challenge with any sort of learning game. And then, like, will they play it if there wasn't like a randomized controlled trial to see if the thing works or not? Yeah. But I think if it's put in early, like for example, problem-based learning comes from medical schools. Like see the medical students come in and they have to diagnose what's happening with the patient, and that seems to be a really good point where games can be put in. I also find I'm on the advisory board for Quandary, which is a game that spun out of MIT, and that's an interesting one because it puts like responsible decision making and perspective taking. So if there's some games that are out there for medical world that take on empathy and then fast-paced decision making, emergency room decision making, bedside empathy. So basically 2 parts of social emotional learning, but not everything because then it becomes too heavy. Yeah, but thank you, thank you. There was another question back there. Yes. Oh, you got to.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is around as children develop, right? We work with a lot of organizations that parents are often, concerned about, okay, what is the right age to introduce a certain concept and things like that. So our approach has kind of been like look at the ages at which cognitive skills kind of develop and are kind of seen in studies to this is around the age to kind of bring that in. But my child is ready to engage in this conversation or to have this conversation.
Yeah, I love that question. That's a great question. So my son is like, I was able to always curate the good games for him, right? I mean, right now he's Roblox all the way, right? Which is a great game. But I was able to give him access to the better games, right? Like the wind became something. Greed does that too with grief. And I found that when he was reading in school, he was very much faster, I guess, better able to understand which might be concepts that may not quite be age appropriate, like understanding symbolism, because he's played the symbolism so much in games. So there's still the challenge in classrooms, and what I've observed, and we wrote in this one of the articles that I shared in there, is this idea of pairing books and games together. And you don't even have to play the whole game in a classroom, just thematically. So a game on grief and like lost words, and there's a book that we have in our article, which is also about grief. My son does this in his school all the time. They will read a novel, and then they will watch a film, and then they have this Socratic discussion about it. So why not add in a narrative game, right? And to me, that seems like a pretty easy opportunity. You know, you could even play one controller on a projector for 10 minutes, and then have that discussion, right? Because the game is giving you agency where you're embodying some of the elements in the book, and that can create a lot of different entry points for children that struggle with reading. Also, not all children have luckily experienced grief. But when you're playing in a game like Lost Words, and then you read a book about grief, you can bring that experience to the book and vice versa. So, it turns out it takes a nuanced approach, right? Teaching is an art. Well, thank you so much. I think that's all the time, right? Oh, is there any other question? Oh, yes, sir. Last question. No pressure. Well, there's two hands up. I don't know. Rock, paper, scissors? Okay.
So I saw this image about mirrors, windows, and sliding doors,
Yeah.
and I think there's a lot of like you said, there's a lot of intersection between the three. So specifically when we come to windows, sliding doors, where would you kind of draw like a line, or how would you kind of frame the difference between learning about something new and like putting yourself in like entering the world through the imagination? Is that kind of like feeling like you are in that world, like I know what it's like to be in
Yeah.
this world? Like how do you play the sliding doors?
Yeah, so sliding doors is like being immersed in that world, and it comes from a article which is really used heavily in literacy learning in the U.S. And inclusive books and why we need diverse books. And yeah, it's becoming like you're absorbed in the literary narrative. Is what that means. When Tracy and I in our book, we don't like to declare lines like the system and this. It's not a polarity, but rather a spectrum. So it can be more of a nuance anywhere like in between. So and at certain points you may feel immersed in the world or not. In the other paper we wrote about empathy in games, we also pushed back on the idea that playing as an avatar doesn't necessarily mean that you're feeling empathy for that character, because empathy is projecting your own feelings and thoughts on somebody else. So that's why virtual empathy is a very powerful thing in games. Like a lot of players felt empathy for the cube that they had to destroy in Portal 2, and there's some articles about that, more so than Shelley, who you're playing, even though it's a first-person experience. But yeah, it's kind of, it could be a varying along the lines of the spectrum. Good question. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great conference.